To have a concept in doing anything is pretty important, but especially when it comes to test management within a system test. The test concept outlines the technical approach of testing the system. It gives guidance on the landscape of test possibilities, how testing for a specific system and project is done, and for a specific test object or test plan, it gives guidance on how to apply certain strategies or methods. So basically the context of system test already breaks down the landscape of quality and testing. So to define a test concept for a project, it is to narrow down the remaining landscape and how to apply it for the project you're working with. And the concept incorporates at least 4 different aspects: the test levels, methods, strategy, and the test types, which we will go through in detail now. Starting with the test levels, which are the stages of the system, which also testing is then applied and executed. It affects the way testing is done and especially the viewpoint of when testing is executed. On different levels, testing has a different focus and goal or goals. Also, the people who execute the tests may differ. Looking at a complex system, they do have different levels themselves, obviously. From that, then the test levels derive. So starting at the component level, where you usually have unit tests, and that focuses on a specific component of the system, which can be a software component, but also a physical hardware component. Then the functional level, where you usually have integration tests and look after specific features of the system. It can affect one component for modular architecture or multiple components for integrated architecture. Then you have the product level, where system tests are executed and you have a nearly finished product or already finished product and tested from an end-to-end perspective. And last but not least, the customer level, where you have acceptance tests. That's also timeline-wise the very last test that is executed, where you check from a customer point of view. Sometimes also those tests are done by the customer themselves, where on the other end of the spectrum you have usually developer or very technical stuff that is doing component tests. And in between, that's the area where system test is very important and also very relevant. Then test methods are techniques on how a test is operated. Test methods and test techniques as terms can be used in the same or a similar way. So here I'm using test methods. Starting with black box test methods, those are tests where you have a component or a system and you're not familiar with the inner operations of it. So you need to use other methods to check if the system behaves correctly. And here are various methods listed here. For example, you have state transition testing, when you have a state machine where a system transitions from one state to the other. So there you can test along the various states a system can be in. Or you have use case tests where you have a functional description of a system and you then use those descriptions to test with. So those are pretty important for complex systems. Then you have white box testing. Here, on the other hand, the inner workings of the system is transparent. For example, when you have software, then you have to have access to the code base of it, which enables those listed test methods. For example, you check for all the statements and try to achieve that every statement of the code has one test case or is executed at least once. And you have experience-based test methods. Here you do not follow very specific test specifications, but use other methods to test. For example, exploratory testing, where you just get a system in your hand and start using it, playing it, and also use your experience from the past to try to find any defects. So white box tests are usually not used for system tests. They are more used for only unit tests. But on the other hand, use case testing and experience-based testing, they play a major role when it comes to complex systems. Then the test strategy, which defines the conditions of test execution. Test strategy is highly dependent on the part under test, and it gives guidance for the test planning and the test management then. So listed here are several different test strategies. So for example, you have an expert-based test strategy where you interview experts of the system or of a specific topic and ask them how testing should be done. Or you have change-based testing, which is based on releases or software deployments, and testing is done only after that. In the practical application, you usually have a mix of different test strategies, especially when it comes to complex systems. You have to use multiple ones to have a sufficient test coverage. So for example, you can test every single release or every major release. Then you're testing new features, and you can test based on user feedback in form of any deviation or errors that are reported. And the last component of a test concept are the test types, which are distinct ways of test execution with different intents. Test types are distinct by the other components of the test concept, so the test level, test methods, and the test strategy, and how the test specification is defined, which affects then also the test execution, of course. And it is also important to distinguish between static and dynamic tests. Static tests are not requiring the usage of a product, but those tests are based on documents associated with the product itself. And namely, you can have walkthroughs, reviews, inspections using analysis tools or checklists to test. So those can be very effective and also efficient methods and ways of test. But in system test, you also definitely need to use the product in the dynamic tests. So here you have a lot of different test types. For example, smoke tests, which are executed once you get a new software release to check if it's working in general. But then you of course have also the use case tests, which are really dedicated to test the full scope of the product. Or you also may have some certification relevant tests, and you have regression tests, which are done to ensure that the product keeps working also with minor changes or changes not directly related to a specific feature, etc.